Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more in the Buddha's words. This will be the introduction of Chapter 3, Approaching the Dhamma. So, yeah. With that said, let's just jump into this introduction here. One of the most distressing predicaments any earnest, open minded spiritual seeker might face is the sheer difficulty of choosing from among the bewildering university of religious and spiritual teachings available. By their very nature, spiritual teachings make claims upon our allegiance that are absolute and all encompassing. Adherents to a particular creed are prone to assert that their religion alone reveals the final truth about our place in the universe and our ultimate destiny. They boldly propose that their path alone offers the sure means to eternal salvation. If we could suspend all belief commitments and compare the competing doctrines impartially, submitting them to empirical test, we would have a surefire method of deciding between them, and then our ordeal would be over. But it isn't that simple. Rival religions all propose or presuppose doctrines that cannot directly validate any personal experience. They advocate tenets that call for some degree of trust, so as their tenets and practices clash, we run up against the problem of finding some way to decide between them and negotiate their competing claims to truth. The solution to this problem is to deny that there is any real conflict between alternative belief systems. The adherents of this approach which we might call religious universalism, say that at the core all spiritual traditions teach essentially the same thing. Their formulations may differ, but their inner core is the same, expressed differently merely to accord with different sensibilities. What we need to do, the Universalist says, when faced with different spiritual traditions, is to extract the kernel of inner truth from the pods of their exoteric creeds. From ground level, our goals look different, but in the heights, we might as well find the goal is the same. It is very like the view of the moon from different mountain peaks. Universalists, in matter of doctrine, often endorse eclecticism in practice, holding that we can select whatever practices we prefer and combine them like dishes at a buffet. This solution to the problem of religious diversity has an immediate appeal to those disillusioned with the exclusive claims of dogmatic religion. Honest critical reflection, however, would show that on the most vital issues, the different religions and spiritual traditions take different standpoints. They give us very different answers to our questions concerning the basic grounds and goals of the spiritual quest, and often these differences are not merely verbal. To sweep them away as being merely verbal may be an effective way of achieving harmony between followers of different belief systems, but it cannot withstand close examination. In the end, it is as little tenable as saying that because they have beaks and wings, eagles, sparrows, and chickens are essentially the same type of creature, and differences between them being merely verbal. It is not only theistic religions that teach doctrines beyond the range of immediate empirical confirmation. The Buddha, too, taught doctrines that an extraordinary person cannot directly confirm by everyday experience, and these doctrines are fundamental to the structure of his teaching. We saw, for example, in the introductions to chapters 1 and 2, that the Nikayas envision a universe with many domains of sentient existence spread out in the boundless space and time, a universe in which sentient beings roam and wander from life to life on account of their ignorance, craving, and karma. The Nikayas presuppose that throughout the beginningless time, Buddhas without number have arisen and turned the wheel of Dhamma, and that each Buddha attains enlightenment after cultivating spiritual perfections over long periods of cosmic time. When we approach the Dhamma, we are likely to resist such beliefs and feel that they make excessive demands on our capacity for trust. Thus, we inevitably run up against the question whether, if we should follow the Buddha's teachings, we must take on board the entire package of classical Buddhist doctrine. For early Buddhism, all the problems we face in deciding how far we should go in placing faith can be disposed of at a single stroke. That single stroke involves reverting to direct experience as the ultimate basis for judgment. One of the distinctive features of the Buddha's teachings is the respect it accords to direct experience. The texts of early Buddhism do not teach a secret doctrine, nor do they leave scope for anything like an esoteric path reserved for an elite of initiates and withheld from others. According to text 3.1, secrecy in the religious teaching is a hallmark of wrong views and confused thinking. The teaching of Buddha shines openly, as radiant and brilliant as the light of the sun and the moon. Freedom from the cloak of secrecy is integral to a teaching that gives primacy to direct experience, inviting each individual to test its principles in the crucible of his or her own experience. This does not mean that an ordinary person can fully validate the Buddha's doctrine by direct experience without special effort. To the contrary, the teaching can only be fully realized through the achievement of certain extraordinary types of experience that are far beyond the range of the ordinary person enmeshed in the concerns of mundane life. However, in sharp contrast to revealed religion, the Buddha does not demand that we begin our spiritual quest by placing faith in doctrines that lie beyond the range of our immediate experience. Rather than ask us to wrestle with issues that, for us in our present condition, no amount of experience can decide, he instead asks us to consider a few simple questions pertaining to our immediate welfare and happiness. Questions that we can answer on the basis of personal experience. I highlight the expression "for us in our present condition" because the fact that we cannot presently validate such matters does not constitute grounds for rejecting them as invalid or even as irrelevant. It only means that we should put them aside for the time being and concern ourselves with issues that come within the range of direct experience. The Buddha says that his teaching is about suffering and cessation of suffering. This statement does not mean that the Dhamma is concerned only with our experience of suffering in the present life, but it does imply that we can use our present experience, backed by intelligent observation, as a criterion for determining what is beneficial and what detrimental to our spiritual progress. Our most insistent existential demand, springing up deep within us, is the need for freedom from harm, sorrow, and distress, or, positively stated, the need to achieve well-being and happiness. However, to avoid harm and to secure our well-being, it is not sufficient for us merely to hope. We first have to understand the conditions on which they depend. According to the Buddha, whatever arises through appropriate causes and conditions, and this applies to with equal force to suffering and happiness. Thus, we must ascertain the causes and conditions that lead to harm and suffering, and likewise the causes and conditions that lead to well-being and happiness. Once we have extracted these two principles, the conditions leading to harm and suffering and the conditions leading to well-being and happiness, we have at our disposal an outline of the entire process that leads to the ultimate goal, final liberation from suffering. The text offering the excellent example from this approach is a short discourse in the Anguttara Nikaya, popularly known as the Kalama Sutta, included as text, chapter 3, section 2. The Kalamas were a people living in a remote area of the Ganges plain. Various religious teachers would come to visit, and each would extol his own doctrine and tear down the doctrines of his rivals. Confused and perplexed by this, the Buddha passed through their town. Confused and perplexed by this conflict of belief systems, the Kalamas did not know whom to trust. When the Buddha passed through their town, they approached him and asked him to clear away their doubts. Though the text does not specify what particular issues were troubling the Kalamas, the later part of the discourse makes it clear that their perplexities revolved around the questions of rebirth and karma. The Buddha began by assuring the Kalamas that under such circumstances it was proper for them to doubt, for the issues that troubled them were indeed common issues of doubt and perplexity. He then told them not to rely on 10 sources of belief, for 4 of these pertain to the established scriptural authority, oral tradition, lineage of teaching, hearsay, and collections of texts. 4 to traditional grounds, logic, inferential reasoning, reasoned cogitation, and the acceptance of a view after pondering it, and 2 to authoritative persons, impressive speakers, and respected teachers. This advice is sometimes quoted to prove that the Buddha rejected all external authorities and invited each individual to fashion his or her own path to truth. Read in context, however, the message the Kalama Sutta is quite different. The Buddha is not advising the Kalamas, who, it must be stressed, had at this point not yet become his own disciples, to reject all authoritative guides and spiritual understanding and fall back solely on their personal intuition. Rather, he is offering them a simple and pragmatic outlet from the morass of doubt and perplexity in which they are immersed. By the use of skillful methods of inquiry, he leads them to understand a number of basic principles that they can verify by their own experience and thereby acquire a sure starting point for further spiritual development. Always underlying the Buddha's questions and their replies is the tacit premise that people are primarily motivated to act by concern for their own welfare and happiness. In asking this particular set of questions, the Buddha's purpose is to lead the Kalamas to see that even when they suspend all concern with future lives, unwholesome mental states such as greed, hatred, and delusion, and unwholesome actions such as killing and stealing, eventually redound to one's own harm and suffering right here and now. Conversely, wholesome mental states and wholesome actions promote one's long-term welfare and happiness here and now. Once this much is seen, the immediately visible harmful consequences to which unwholesome mental states lead become a sufficient reason for abandoning them, while the visible benefits for the wholesome mental states had become a sufficient motivation for cultivating them. Then, whether or not there is life after death, one has adequate reasons in the present life to abandon wholesome mental states and cultivate abandon unwholesome mental states and cultivate wholesome mental states. If there is an afterlife, one's recompense is simply that much greater. A similar approach underlies text chapter 3, section 3, in which the Buddha demonstrates how present suffering arises and ceases in correlation with present craving. This short sutta, addressed to a lay follower, concisely articulates the causal principle that lies behind the Four Noble Truths, but rather than doing so in the abstract, it adopts a concrete, down-to-earth approach that has a remarkably contemporary appeal. By using powerful examples drawn from the life of a layman deeply attached to his wife and son, the sutta makes a deep and lasting impression on us. The fact that such texts as this sutta and the Kalama Sutta do not dwell on the doctrines of karma and rebirth does not mean, as is sometimes assumed, that such teachings are mere cultural accretions or accretions to the Dhamma that can be deleted or explained away without losing anything essential. It means only that at the outset, the Dhamma can be approached in ways that do not require reference to past and future lives. The Buddha's teaching has many sides, and thus, from certain angles, it can be directly evaluated against our concern for present well-being and happiness. Once we see that the practice of the teaching does indeed bring peace, joy, and inner security in this very life, this will inspire our trust and confidence in the Dhamma as a whole, including those aspects that lie beyond our present capacity for personal verification. If we were to undertake the certain practices that require highly refined skills and determined effort, we would be able to acquire the faculties needed to validate those other aspects in the law of karma, the reality of rebirth, and the existence of supersensible realms. Another major problem that often besets spiritual seekers is the demands that teachers place upon the capacity for trust. This problem has become especially acute in our own time when the news media gleefully spotlight the frailties of numberless gurus and jump at a chance to show the modern day saint as nothing better than a swindler in robes. But the problem of rogue gurus is a perennial one, by no means peculiar to our age. When one person exercises spiritual authority over others, it is only too easy for that person to be tempted to exploit the trust others place in him in ways that can be seriously detrimental to himself and his disciples. When a pupil capable of teaching the path to final liberation, when a pupil approaches a teacher who is perfectly enlightened and thus capable of teaching the path to liberation, the pupil must have some criteria at hand for testing the teacher to determine whether the teacher truly measures up to the lofty claims he makes about himself, or that others make about him. In the Vimamsaka Sutta, chapter 3, section 4, the Buddha lays down guidelines by which the monk can test the Tathagata, that is, the Buddha, to evaluate the claim to be perfectly enlightened. The benchmark of perfect enlightenment is freedom of the mind from all defilements. If a monk cannot directly see into the Buddha's own mind, he can nevertheless rely on the indirect evidence to ascertain that the Buddha is freed from defilements. That is, by evaluating the Buddha's bodily deeds and speech, he can infer that the Buddha's mental states are exclusively pure, uninfluenced by greed, hatred, and delusion. In addition to such observational inference, the Buddha further encourages the monk to approach him and directly inquire about his mental states. Once the pupil gains confidence that the Buddha is a qualified teacher, he then puts the master to the ultimate test. He learns his teaching, enters upon the practice, and penetrates the Dhamma by direct knowledge. This act of penetration, here equivalent at minimum to the attainment of stream entry, brings the gain of invincible faith, the faith of one who is established in the irreversible path leading to final release. Taken in isolation, the Vimamsaka Sutta might give the impression that one acquires faith only after gaining realization of the teaching, and since realization is self-validating, faith would become redundant. This impression, however, could be one-sided. The point the sutta is making is that faith becomes invincible as a result of realization, not that faith first enters the spiritual path only when one attains realization. Faith is the first of the 5 spiritual faculties, and in some degree, as trusting confidence in the Buddha's enlightenment and the main principles of his teaching, it is prerequisite for the higher training. We see faith functioning in the preparatory role in text 5, section 5, or chapter 3, section 5, as long as the Kanki Sutta, as a long excerpt from the Kanki Sutta. Here the Buddha explains that a person who has faith in something preserves truth when he says, "This is my faith." He preserves truth because he merely states that he believes without jumping to the conclusion that what he believes is definitely true and anything else contrary to it false. The Buddha contrasts the preservation of truth, Sakamurakana, with the discovery of truth, Sakanuboddha, which begins by placing faith in the teacher who has proved himself worthy of trust. Having gained faith in such a teacher, one then approaches him for instruction, learns the Dhamma, practices it according to a series of steps more finely calibrated than in the preceding text, and finally sees the supreme truth for oneself. This does not yet mark the end of the road for the disciple, but only the initial breakthrough to the truth, again corresponding to the attainment of stream entry. Having achieved the vision of truth, to reach the final arrival of truth, Sakanupati, that is, the attainment of errantship for final liberation, one must repeat, develop, and cultivate the same series of steps until one has fully absorbed and assimilated the supreme truth disclosed by the initial vision. Thus, the entire process of training in the Dhamma is rooted in personal experience. Even faith should be rooted in investigation and inquiry and not based solely upon emotional leanings and blind belief. Faith alone is insufficient, but the door to deeper levels of experience. Faith serves as a spur to practice. Practice leads to experiential understanding. And when one's understanding matures, it blossoms into full realization. But that is our introduction to chapter 3. So yeah, we're getting into much longer pieces. A lot of the beginning 2 chapters seemed introductory almost to ideas and thoughts presented by the Buddha. But yeah, chapter 3 seems to be more in depth, longer pieces, longer texts, if you shall. But apparently we're also going to encounter the issue of false leaders. And honestly, seeing if I haven't cleared, I gotta re-clean my webcam there. Anyway, yeah. Even among the mainstream religions, there are false leaders. Think of the big church pastors. And they're always calling for money. Or think of those who make a show of hands-on healing. I free you from this demon, this affliction. Yeah. There are a lot of hucksters out there. Swindlers. As in the book's word, swindler. But yeah. So we often deal with those seeking personal gratification in some form, corrupting the trust and faith of those seeking truth and help. Personally, like I said, I've made this clear before, I'm an atheist, but I believe there is a way for spiritual help. It's just, you often have to look beyond the large churches. Often it would be a small backwoods church or a small mosque somewhere. Because usually, not always, people are just wanting hope, something to believe in. And so they're searching. Like I said, most people of any faith are good people. It's the loud, boisterous, egotistical, ones that are often the evil, the violent. And they give a bad name to others. So yeah. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.